Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 1 The Great Discovery. Looking back at all that has happened to me since that eventful day, I am hardly able to believe that my adventures were real. They were so wonderful that, even now, I am amazed when I think about them. I was living with my uncle, a German who was a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, and mineralogy, and many other ologies. Professor Hardwigg, my uncle, had invited me to study under him, for I was greatly interested in learning as much as I could about the earth and what lies under its surface. Although my uncle was a most learned man, he could speak with greats of the scientific world almost in any language, and could classify 600 different geological specimens by their weight, hardness, sound, taste, and smell. He did not at all look the part. He was 50 years old, tall, thin, and wiry. His large glasses hid his vast round bulging eyes. His nose was thin like a file, and was constantly being attracted to tobacco. When he walked, he stepped a yard at a time, clenching his fist as if he were going to hit you, and then walked on. At most times he was far from a pleasant companion, but Professor Hardwigg is by no means a bad sort of man. However, to live with him means to obey. So when he came home one day and began to call, Harry, 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 I hastened to go at once, even though at the time I was more interested in finding out what was being prepared for dinner than what my uncle wanted from me. I took the steps three at a time, and presented myself to my uncle in his study. My uncle's study was a perfect museum, filled with minerals of every kind. When I entered, he was studying a book, not even aware that I had joined them in the room. Wonderful, he said to himself as he studied the book. Wonderful. The book was an old one, yellow with age, and just the book my uncle enjoyed the most. Did you want something from me, uncle? I asked. It is the Heimskringla of Snorre Turleson, he said, the famous Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is an account of Norwegian princes who ruled Iceland. What language is in it? I asked, hoping that it would be a German translation that I could read, but my uncle would have nothing of translations, only originals would do. It's a runic manuscript, he said, the language of the original population of Iceland. He was angry at my ignorance. My uncle had picked up the book to show me the strange letters of this language, when a scrap of paper fell from between two yellowed pages. My uncle seized the paper like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread. It was an ancient parchment, about 3 inches to 5 inches, with strange-looking characters written all over it. It's runic, my uncle declared, his voice and fingers trembling. I looked at it. Little did I know that this small parchment would lead us onto one of the most wondrous adventures ever known to man. But while my uncle could read runic, he could not decipher the meaning of the letters on the parchment. Just then the cook called us up till the dinner was ready. I could not be bothered with dinner, my uncle yelled, but I was hungry and went to dinner. I went just finishing my last of my dessert wine when I heard my uncle roaring to me to come at once. I made a leap for the stairs to his study, so loud and fierce was his call. My uncle was sitting, staring at the small piece of parchment. I declare you that it was the runic, he yelled. It contained some wonderful secret that I must get at any cost. I looked at the letters of the parchment. They made no sense to my eye. Sit down, my uncle cried fiercely, and write what I tell you to write. I obeyed at once. I will substitute a letter of our alphabet for that of runic, he said, and we will see what it will produce. He dictated the letters of these 21 words. None of them made sense to me. Mr. Ernels, Stigmumph, Cadsam, Idrul, Untif, Alstrate, Jades, Nickdirk, Soudern, Emtail, Advar, Sidurn, Ditak, Nuak, Nurkirk, Etul, Isbo, Realsa, Ieba, Frantul Kilda. Scarcely giving me time to finish taking them down, he snatched the paper from my hand, then examined it with deep concentration. I should like to know what it means, he said, as much to me. But I certainly could not tell him. It reminds me of a cryptograph, a puzzle, he said. I may be on the verge of a great discovery. My opinion was that it was all rubbish, but I kept that opinion for myself, as my uncle's anger was not easy to bear. "The parchment and the book are written in different hands," he said. "The book is about 200 years older than the parchment, so the parchment must have been written by some person who had owned the book later than the original owner. So, the next question is, who owned this book?" On the inside of the cover, my uncle found at what first looked like an ink stain, but on a closer inspection it proved to be a line of writing almost rubbed away by time. My uncle studied the letters. "Arne Sokkenim," my uncle cried in triumph. He owned this book. He was a brilliant Icelandic professor and chemist of the 16th century. It was he who wrote this mysterious words on the parchment, perhaps some astounding discovery of his. My uncle walked around the room in a state of excitement. "Until I discover the meaning of those words, I will neither eat nor sleep." "My dear uncle," I began. "Nor will you either," he cried. I was glad that I had just eaten an unusually large meal. My uncle and I tried various languages and variations of the language on the letters of the parchment. We worked for hours, but the parchment yielded no clue. My uncle felt that Sukanim had written his message in Latin, as most educated men of his time wrote, but the order of the letters provided no known Latin words. Then my uncle began reading the puzzling cryptograph in all sorts of ways, according to some theory of his own, and he had me write the following: Mem suca sinera eisfeco qui signit amert in absurd sir et rotav sid dua ed next sed sadnit la cartinilu j sira rock serbin muta nek mir kark silu koisle effen sinil. It still made no sense to me. My uncle became enraged. He struck the table with his fist, then left the room and the house, slamming the doors behind him as he went. I sat down for a while, relaxing and smoking. Then my mind returned to the parchment, and I picked it up and began studying it again. I found a few scattered Latin words, and an English word, and several French words. It was enough to drive a man mad. The heat in the closed room was too much to bear, and I began to fan myself with the parchment. For the first time, I saw both the front and back of it. Imagine my surprise when, glancing at the back of the parchment, I saw that ink had gone through, revealing the Latin words "craterum, crater, in terrestre, earth." I had discovered the secret. All I had to do was read the parchment was to look at it backwards. My eyes were dazzled, and my hands began to tremble with excitement as I began to read. But what horror and shock possessed me as I discovered the terrible secret! It had really been accomplished. The man to do what? I immediately made a decision. No living being should know this parchment secret. "Never!" I cried. "Never will my uncle learn this dreadful secret. He would immediately undertake the terrible journey revealed in the message. Nothing would stop him. I could not allow such madness, nor could I take the chance to allow my uncle discovering the message. I would have to destroy it. I snatched up the book and the parchment, and was about to toss them into the fire when my uncle entered the room. He did not even notice what I was about to do, as he took the materials from me and began to look at them carefully. My flesh crawled as I realized that he might soon discover the way to read the parchment and its terrible secret. Hours went by, but I dared not leave the room. I went to the sofa and soon fell asleep. When I woke, my uncle was still at work. His red eyes, matted hair, feverish hands testified to his work. I loved him and truly felt sorry for his suffering, but I could not reveal the terrible secret. He continued to study the parchment as night turned to morning, morning turned to afternoon, and about 2 o'clock he gave a loud yell so loud that I almost fell from the sofa, where I was still resting. "Backwards!" he cried. "It is backwards! Oh, how cunning Sukuman was!" Then he began to translate the parchment. "Descend into the crater of Yokel of Sneffel, with a shade of Discontinuous caresses, and Kalends of July, odious traveller, and you will reach the centre of the earth." I did it. Arn Sukunim. My uncle leaped 3 feet off the ground and ran about the room wildly, knocking over tables and chairs, and tossing his book up in the air. "We start at once," he cried, "and you will share my glory." "Start for where?" I asked, afraid to answer. "To the centre of the earth."